Okay, we'd like to welcome everybody to our How to Buy a Telescope session with Trevor McGuire. Um, and good to see everybody. I don't know, you all want to say hello. I'm Jim Browder with the Richmond Astronomical Society. I can see Trevor McGuire there. He's also with the Richmond Astronomical Society and is our presenter for the evening. Um, Chris, you want to say hello? Chris may not be on there yet. Mark, how about you? I think you're muted, Mark.
Oh, there we go. How's that?
That's better.
Got me? Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
excited about this. I've read so much and I'm so confused.
yeah, understood.
I'm
Understood.
looking for, I'm trying to get something for the granddaughters that are getting into high school and they really got an interest for astronomy, and they've got one that sees the moon pretty good, but then, they need to go further. So I'm trying to get something that'll really work with them.
Yeah, and are they in high school? You said.
Yeah. We have a place up at Bryce, which is in next to North Mountain in Northwest Virginia. And so we keep it up there. It sits at about 1,500 feet, right on the West Virginia border. So that's where we're going to keep this, whatever we get. So hopefully that'll really enhance what we're trying to do.
Well, I'll make you a deal. I can store my
Nice
telescope
place,
there.
nice location.
Yeah, I'll store my telescope up there. You can just give me the keys, and we'll share. We'll share. I'll share your location and my telescope. How's that?
That works. Okay. Yeah, for sure.
I see some other folks on there. If anybody wants to say hello, please do. You don't have to, but if you'd like to, say hello.
Hi, everyone.
Good to see you.
I'll just say a quick hi.
That's good. We appreciate that.
Good evening, everybody. Donovan Murray here. Happy to join this evening's event.
We are glad to have you. Okay, if anybody wants to say hello during the presentation or make a comment, please give a yell. So tonight we're having a session on how to buy a telescope, and interestingly, the reason for this is, or the reason that it kind of came to our attention is, we try to do these kinds of things every so often, but it turns out that during the COVID pandemic, telescopes have actually been kind of selling off the shelves. There are some telescope retailers that are running out of stock. They're having to reorder stock, and apparently this is certainly unexpected, but apparently because people are interested in doing hobbies and activities and things like that they can do in alone in their backyard, wherever they might be, outside of a group gathering. So people have turned to astronomy apparently, and there's kind of a renewed interest in it. So we thought it might be a good opportunity to talk about how to buy a telescope. And the reason for that is, as Mark just mentioned, if you go to the market and you just look at all the telescopes available, there are gobs of different options. You can find some very inexpensive telescopes, and you can also sink a load of dough into a telescope, no question about it. But those of us that have been in this hobby a while and have been through the experience of buying a telescope can really help somebody who's starting out, guide them a little bit, and show them the options that are right for them, and in particular show them options that are not good, because there are a lot of kind of low price, low quality telescopes on the market, and some of those are to be avoided. So Trevor's our presenter tonight. Trevor's been an observer for a long time and has helped people make telescope purchases in the past. Knows a lot about it, so he's going to share his experience with us and offer some suggestions. And many thanks to Trevor for doing this. We really appreciate it. And with that, Trevor, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, sounds good. So as Jim mentioned while he was talking there, if you have any questions at any point, do not hesitate to interrupt me. Obviously, I can't. We don't have that face to face. So just do what you can. You're not really gonna knock me off my stride or anything. I am more of a kind of bare slides presenter and more of a talking point presenter. So by all means, if I say something that that you have a question about, stop me, and I'm happy to expand upon things. So additionally, I'd like to point out that I am on my laptop here, and I'm in full screen mode on my presentation, so I literally can't see anybody. So you can feel free to blank out, fall asleep, walk away, come back, do whatever. I'm not going to see anything. So I'm just talking to my empty screen here. But I do have a couple of things to hold up to my camera, and if I need to adjust that, just yell out to me, higher, lower, closer, further back, whatever. It's easier than minimizing my presentation to look at my screen again. So with all that said, let me try to jump into this. As you can see here, I've just got a kind of a smattering of telescope pictures, and we'll kind of talk about some things. So most common question I get is, what is the best beginner telescope? And for anybody who has any hobbies, a lot of hobbies have similar questions like this. What is the best beginner, bike or kayak or pistol or whatever you happen to be into? Someone's going to ask you this. And I used to say, back before the world ended, that the best beginner thing to do was to go to one of our stargazes, because you'd see a lot of different telescopes and actually be able to look through a lot of them and talk to the astronomers. But we're in the post-COVID world now, so that's kind of off the table. So my general answer here is, first and foremost, your eyes. And I mean that on a lot of different levels. I actually have an entire hour-long presentation that I give on just naked eye astronomy. All the different things you can see with just your eyes, no equipment necessary. And the quick rundown is, the moon is great to look at with just your eyes. You can see satellites flying over. You can see meteors. You can pick out constellations. You can do all manner of things with just your eyes. So there's a lot of material out there for naked eye observing. So let's say you've done that and you say, you know what, I want to see more. Next thing I suggest is binoculars. And that might sound funny. You're like, well, don't we use binoculars for sporting events or what have you? And sure, but they also do, they magnify things, usually 15, 20 times. For your kind of regular off-the-shelf binocular. And looking at the moon takes on a whole new dimension with binoculars. You can look in the sky and you can split double stars. With the naked eye, it might look like one star. With binoculars, you can see two stars, and all kinds of things like that. I've actually, and this just came to me, I've never tried to look at the International Space Station flying over with binoculars. I've looked at it with my telescope and you can see the solar panels and stuff, but I'm curious what you could see in a binocular. I've never tried it. But just to give you an idea, this picture here is kind of like your standard set of binoculars. This is, tell me if you can see that well, but this is, you kind of get an idea. I'm an average sized person. This is a set of astronomical binoculars. This has a 70 millimeter aperture on the, that's the front. And these things can see a lot. And you can buy binocular mounts that make it easier, but I just go handheld with these, always have, and I've seen a lot of things. But let's say you want to go one size bigger. These are 70 millimeter. These are 80 millimeter. See, they're quite a bit different. But again, 80 millimeter, you can see a lot more. Again, the mount to put this on a tripod makes it easier to look through them. And these are not expensive devices. I will, just to make some people jealous, I actually found these at a thrift store in Illinois for $10. So I got a really good deal on these ones. But these 70 millimeter ones, they're under $100 through Celestron. And they're great. So just a couple of things about binoculars. If you're just thinking about, hey, I've got a pair of binoculars, let me go grab them and see. Binoculars generally come in two shapes that you probably know of, and they are based on the prism that's inside. There could be the roof prism or the plural prism. The roof prisms are those really, really small binoculars that are popular among birders. They fold up real small. They're straight. They're not as good for astronomy because you can't get good apertures with those. And so the plural prisms are what you're looking for. So here's a span. So the binoculars I just showed you are the third and fourth ones on here, and then the ones all the way to the right are probably 90 millimeter, and yeah, those are getting pretty big at that point. They're not handheld anymore. But just like with telescopes, binoculars, you can spend as much money as you could ever want to. They can get very, very expensive. They can get very whiz-bangy. They have like temporary image stabilization in them, and there are some crazy, crazy binoculars out there. I keep things pretty simple. All right, so you're through naked eye, you're through binoculars, and you say, I still want more power. I want to get the full-on telescope. So I'm going to go over the two primary constructions of telescopes, and then some pros and cons for each kind, and kind of some price points that you could think about them and what you might want to look for and not look for. So the two primary differences are the reflecting and the refracting telescopes. Reflecting does exactly what it sounds like. It reflects. So that uses a mirror. And refracting telescopes, not a word that we use in everyday language most of the time, but refracting means like bending light. All right, so these use glass lenses, usually glass. And that's, so we'll talk about the refracting telescopes first for one main reason. Right? Basically, when you think of telescope, if you tell a child to draw a telescope, they're going to draw this picture right here. This is your quintessential telescope. It's a refractor. This is the telescope that Galileo used, a refracting telescope. They're long, they're thin usually, depends on how big the lens is. Right? They have a glass lens at the front, and they have an eyepiece, which is also another glass lens on the other end. Light travels through, it goes into your eye. It's a very, very, very simple design. Yeah, and there's not much more to say about it. It's on, they're usually on a tripod. They look exactly like they do here. This is pretty much the Richmond Astronomical Society logo. Like I said, when you draw a telescope, this is what you have in mind. Right? So let's talk a little bit about how they work. I just mentioned it. This is the basic design. Light goes in the front. The objective lens is curved. And the idea is it effectively makes your eyeball bigger. So the bigger the objective lens, the bigger your new eyeball is. So the light comes in straight. It hits the curved lens, which bends the light. And then the amount that it bends dictates how long the telescope has to be, because the idea is you get that bend to be just right so that when it hits the eyepiece, the light straightens back out and it hits your eyeball. Voila, that's how a telescope works. So the bigger the eye on the front, the longer the telescope, the less bend you have in the light, and that's what you're looking for. It's possible to have a giant lens that's really curvy, so your telescope is shorter, but I'll talk about in a second maybe why that's kind of bad. So refracting telescopes, boy, they run the gamut. All right, they vary greatly in price and quality, and that's one of the reasons why we're giving a talk like this. So one of the major factors that makes up the price and the quality of a refractor is the makeup of that objective lens at the front, because usually it's not just a single piece of glass. If it is a single piece of glass, that's the cheapest they come, right? So I guess you would probably call that a singlet, one lens, but they can come in 1, 2, or 3 lenses. if they have 2 or 3 lenses, we usually call them an achromatic or just an achromat, and an apochromatic telescope or apochromat or just apo. So apo is usually how you would hear a telescope with 3 lenses being talked about. So I know it's hard to keep achromatic and apochromatic apart, in my opinion, but generally speaking, if you see those words being used, you already know that you're not talking about the cheapest possible level, which is, kind of good. So let's talk about why. And this has to do with the curvature of the lenses. Different colors of light in the visible spectrum. Well, all light, all electromagnetic waves have different wavelengths. And because the colors have different wavelengths, when they hit curved glass, they bend differently. So this is your classic physics test in high school. You shine white light on a prism, and the rainbow comes out on the other side. That's because different wavelengths of light do different things when they hit curved materials. So the idea here is that when you put that second lens in, when you turn a singlet into a doublet, you do it in such a way that you can correct that disbursement of light a little bit. And when you have 3 lenses, you can correct it almost completely. Right? When it's uncorrected, when you look at a bright object like the moon or a bright star, you're going to see like a yellow halo in your eyepiece. We call that chromatic aberration. It's not the end of the world. This telescope I have behind me is a doublet, so a achromatic telescope. When I look at very bright things, which I don't like to do because it hurts my eyes, but if I'm looking at the moon unfiltered with this thing, yeah, I'll see some yellow haloing. Really, it's not the end of the world, because the price difference between a doublet and a triplet is prohibitive to me. It's not worth it to me. But for me personally, an achromatic telescope, the price difference between a singlet and a doublet, that is worth it to me. Right? So here's a couple of standard animations or a couple of standard pictures for chromatic aberration. This is the idea. The light that is traveling straight is it might be white light, it might be colored light, depending on what you're looking at. But when it hits that curved lens, it's like a prism. It starts to break up those colors. Right? But in the doublet, like I said, which is what I have behind me here, there's that second piece of glass that's curved differently behind the first one, and it bends that light back a little bit. And the idea is the telescope is constructed well enough that those colors will all cross at the same point later on. And likewise, when you have the triplet, it's the same 2 lenses again, but then a third lens that effectively corrects the aberration. Right? So that's what you're paying for. The difference between the singlet, doublet, and triplet is chromatic aberration. And generally speaking, if a telescope manufacturer is going to go through the trouble of trying to sell you a telescope that has 3 lenses in the front, they are also going to build up the rest of the telescope to be of a similar quality. So that's really the problem with like buying a singlet, is if it's only got the 1 lens in the front, they're not going to take the rest of the telescope seriously either. So that's why that matters. All right, so just a couple of quick advantages, disadvantages. Refracting telescopes are really, really, really good for things that are in our solar system. So planets, moons, comets, really good for that. Pretty simple operation. Generally speaking, you put them on a tripod, you point, you look. Pretty straightforward. If you want to get into astrophotography, a tripod-mounted, motor-driven refracting telescope will get you a long way. And I have this thing, I've written more accessories. I'm going to talk a little bit more about accessories later. But when I say more accessories, I generally mean as compared to a telescope that I'm going to show you later. So these things, they're a little bit, like I said, a little bit more accessorizable. And that has to do with things like astrophotography and different kinds of mounting. And you can have motors and you can have computers and you can put a solar filter on the front of a refracting telescope easier than a reflecting telescope usually. So there's, the sky's the limit for more accessories that you might want to get. And I'm happy to talk about those later. Advantages, they cost more than a reflecting telescope and they're less repairable, meaning if you drop it, if you knock a lens out of alignment, these things are generally not designed for the hobbyist to repair or to take apart or things like that. You generally don't want to go spraying Windex on the lens to try to clean it. Don't do that, please. So if you do drop it, if you do break it, you're going to be in rough shape. Okay. Again, stop me at any point if you have any questions. So now let's talk about reflecting telescopes. Reflecting telescopes, again, break up into two of their own categories, but I'm going to focus on the one that I think I should focus more on for a first telescope. So let me get the other one out of the way first. So reflecting telescopes, sometimes people don't even recognize it as a telescope. I have many times taken out my reflecting telescope to public events, and unless you've seen one before, it doesn't look like a telescope because it doesn't have the tripod. And they're like, well, what is this thing? It looks like I'm going to drop a mortar round into it. I'll show you in a minute what I mean. So in a reflecting telescope, as I mentioned earlier, instead of a lens at the front, you've got a mirror in the back. And the mirror is curved, it's parabolic, not curved enough to like eat cereal out of, but it has a slight curvature to it. It will collect dew and things of that nature, you'll see it. And it has another mirror at the top that's flat. And if this is the only description I gave to you, you'd probably have absolutely no idea how this thing works. Right? So I'll show you a picture in a second. But these are called the primary and the secondary mirrors. The primary is the curved one at the bottom. It's the big one. The secondary is the flat one at the top. So this is roughly how it works. You've got incoming light over here. So this is what, you're pointing this thing at whatever you want to see. The light comes in. There's this thing that's floating in the middle, and you might wonder how it's floating in the middle. We could talk about that. It travels past the flat mirror, hits the curved mirror at the bottom. This is where the light bends for the first time. Okay? So the light will bend when it hits the parabolic mirror. And if everything is aligned properly, this now bent light will hit the flat mirror here, which is at a 45-degree angle, which then shoots out to the eyepiece. And the whole time it's converging back to the focal point. So it hasn't hit the focal point here yet. That's a common misconception. It doesn't actually focus on the secondary mirror, right? It's heading back to your eyepiece, which is again glass. It's the same eyepiece from your refractor. Both kinds of telescopes using the same eyepieces, which is really nice. Right? So this is obviously a cross section, but this secondary mirror here is actually held in place by very thin pieces of metal, like usually 4 of them, that cut across from the side of the telescope. And you might say, well, doesn't that block the light coming in? And absolutely, yes, it does a little bit. And this mirror is usually a couple inches in diameter. Yes, it also blocks some of the light that's coming in, but not very much. Right? So that's the whole point. All of this stuff is open to the air, and it's just kind of floating out there, which is kind of neat, I think. Right? So reflecting telescopes, back to this picture. These things, if this mirror is really big on the bottom, and I will describe what big is in a little bit, But if this if this mirror is big because you want to collect a lot of light, then this whole tube right here, this whole tube assembly, is going to get very long. And again, I'll describe what those adjectives mean very shortly. But some enterprising engineers at some point decided, hey, you know what? I want a big mirror, but I don't want a really long tube. So to combat this, I'm basically going to cut the tube in half and have another mirror that's going to bounce my light back and forth twice. So if you start bouncing the light around inside the tube, it effectively gives you more time to get this bent light to come back together. So that's what I mean when I'm talking about a compounding reflecting telescope. And there are lots of different versions of this, but there are two popular ones. They are the Schmidt Cassigrain and the Maksutov. So this is what a Schmidt Cassigrain looks like. Again, the light is coming in from this side. It's going to travel through this thing that's called a Schmidt corrector that you don't need to know about right now, but it looks like a piece of glass on the front of the telescope. It hits the big mirror. It hits a smaller mirror, and then it comes back through a hole in the primary mirror back to your eyeball back here. So this effectively takes a telescope tube that is 3 times longer and makes it short again. So let's take a look at one of these things. Right. This is what a Schmidt-Cass telescope looks like. They're usually mounted on a tripod, but they're always mounted on a tripod. They're usually motorized. They're not super high-end telescopes, but they are, generally speaking, probably a little bit higher than a beginner telescope. You can get them in a little bit smaller size that's a little bit more affordable, but they have a lot of bells and whistles to them usually. They've got the computer, they've got the motor drive. Some of them have GPS. Some of them have self-leveling capabilities. So, you've got a lot of options here, but they're very compact. They're stout little machines. They're very popular as a mid-range telescope usually. And some people do some pretty killer astrophotography with these things, which is a can of worms I'm not going to get into. Right. Here's another popular design. Looks very similar. This is a Maksutov. Generally speaking, these Maksutovs come in much smaller sizes. I think this is an ETX 125. Very common telescope. Packs quite a bit of bang for the buck. It looks like overkill for that tiny telescope sitting on top, but it's a decent little scope. I have seen these things pop up at in Goodwills and stuff because people don't really know what they're doing, and they buy one of these things for a couple $100 and then they get bored with it or whatever. Lots of telescopes in closets, but these Maksutovs generally don't get very big, and there's probably an engineering reason for that I just don't know, because I'm not I'm not into the engineering side of these things. So now let's talk about the ones that I do know a lot about. So again, I just want to point out that these Schmidt-Casses and the Maksutovs, they're kind of black boxy. You buy them, you mount them, you use them. You don't have to do a lot to them. Change the batteries every once in a while. That's about it. I think this ETX here, I think it runs on like a couple of AA batteries. If memory serves, I've only used them a couple of times, but they're pretty efficient. And then usually these Schmidt-Casses, you'll see somebody will have like one of those portable car charging type units that they plug, like a 12-volt unit that they plug the telescope in. It runs all night. So let's talk about the simple reflecting telescopes, because these are about as simple as they come. So this means, again, mirror at the bottom, mirror at the top. When it comes to simple reflecting telescopes, the mount makes a big difference, because if you put a simple reflecting telescope on a tripod, we call that a Newtonian telescope because these were invented by Newton. But there's a different kind of mount that you can use called the altitude azimuth mount, or more commonly we call it an alt-az mount. And these are the ones that people really look at you sideways, like, that's not a telescope. So this is a Newtonian telescope. It's a simple reflecting telescope sitting on top of a tripod. It looks real funny, doesn't it? But these things are really light. So you can put a pretty big telescope sitting on top of a tripod like that, and it'll look a little funny. This is not a very common setup. You can't put a very large telescope up there because the tripod just has to be way too big. Side note, this is the exact same tripod I have behind me. Very common tripod, very sturdy. It ships with a lot of telescope mounts. I've been using it for years. I love it. It's easy, bomb-proof. You're not going to knock this telescope over. But this is an Altaz mount. So the way this thing works is you've got a pivot point right here. The telescope sits inside this cradle, and then this circular bit right here also rotates. So you've got the sorry, monkey, I'm doing something. Okay, all right, sorry, hold on. My 4-year-old has something that he has to tell me. Yes. Well, you probably shouldn't have thrown a cup of water. Why did you do that?
Because I saw there was no water.
Oh, okay, it was an accident. All right. Okay, well, I'll be done in a little bit, and then we'll talk about it. All right, can you close the door, please? Or do you want to come sit with me? Okay, sorry, we had a little bit of meltdown here. Okay, we're going to have somebody join us. Okay, so this is an Altaz mount. And like I was saying, the telescope pivots right here. So you've got this levering action. That's the altitude part. And the azimuth is the fact that the whole thing rotates horizontally. So between those two motions, you can see the entire sky. And this is an insanely simple design. It works really, really, really well for what it does. Right? Now, when you put a simple reflecting telescope on an Altaz mount, we call it a Dobsonian because this type of thing was invented by a person named John Dobson. And to give you just an interesting take on that, John Dobson is definitely not a contemporary of, say, Newton. John Dobson actually just left us recently, and his goal was to bring astronomy to the masses. So he kind of invented this Altaz mount idea, and famously his telescopes were like built out of garbage and stuff. It was kind of his shtick. I think the story goes that his first big telescope he built, he ground the mirror himself using like an old like porthole glass out of a ship or something like that. So it's kind of cool. I guess he was like a monk or something in San Francisco. I don't really know the details, but I guess he led an interesting life. All right. Now I promised earlier that I would talk about how big these things get. So this is a Dobsonian telescope with John Dobson, just to give you an idea of how big they can get. And this is actually not even that unusual of a size. You go to any major star party and some joker is going to pull up with a trailer and pull one of these things out of it. Like, yes, they're expensive, but it's not like mortgage your house expensive. It's like, the cost of a nice car. So I've seen these types of telescopes at this size. And maybe I'm misremembering, but they sell for, in the vicinity of buying a nice car. So if you're really serious about a hobby and you've been doing it for a long time, sure, you can splurge on something like this, but you can't use this in your backyard. Like you got to be way out in the dark skies to use something like this. But you notice it doesn't have a tube, because a tube of this size would be, just way too heavy. So this is called a truss tube Dobsonian, meaning it breaks apart and all these tubes come off, and then this is the upper cage, and it comes off separately. So it breaks down small enough to fit into like a minivan or a little trailer. But anyway, this is not a beginner scope, but it gives you an idea of how big these things can get. Okay. So let's do some quick advantages, disadvantages for Dobs. Again, these are not for the compound reflectors, but just the Dobsonians. They are hands down the least expensive option to get you into astronomy. They are bomb-proof. This telescope back here, you could you could ride this thing down the stairs and then set it back up, and it would work just fine. They are really, really, really tough machines. This one, not so much. Don't ride that one down the stairs. They would have some. They'd be upset with you. You can get big apertures. The bigger your aperture, the bigger the mirror, the bigger the light, or the more light you can take in, the fainter objects you can see. Right? Some disadvantages. They don't have a lot of accessories. What you see is what you get with these things, generally speaking. You have very limited photography capabilities. And I say they're less forgiving on body types. The reason I say that is because if you have a tripod for your refracting telescope, you can usually adjust the height of that tripod to make it more comfortable for you. But notice with a Dobsonian, again, what you see is what you get. If you point this thing straight up, that's as high as it goes. So if your tube, if your entire telescope is only is 4 feet long, you can see from this picture that you're going to spend most of the night bent over. There are astronomy chairs that make it a little bit easier, but these things, they can be hard on your back during a long observing session. So that's just one thing to keep in mind. You're going to spend a lot of time kind of hunkered over, but I don't know, maybe you just get used to it. I don't really like the astronomy chairs. I've tried to use them over the years, haven't had much luck with them. And again, the photography, because for photography, you usually need motors, and Dobsonians, they can be motorized, but even then, photography doesn't work very well because of something called field rotation that I won't get into. All right, I've mentioned computers and motors a couple of times throughout the talk, so let me just kind of make my peace with this. All right, I am not a big fan of computerized telescopes. I'm a little bit more old school. The telescope you see behind me does have a motor on it, but it does not have a computer. And so the logic behind that is, if I'm using that telescope behind me, which I usually use for outreach events, or if I want to look at a planet, I'll take that telescope out, all right, because it's very good for planets. But so like I said, I have a motor, but no computer. So if I point to an object and then turn the motor on, it will stay on that object, which is really good for doing outreach events. Dexter, I need you to be quiet, buddy, because I'm talking, right? All right. So let's talk about the computerized versus manual trade-off, right? If you have a fixed budget and you say, I'm going to spend this much money on a telescope, if you say, I want a computer, that is automatically going to cut down on your aperture, or on the amount of light that you can collect, right? So that's your trade-off. No computer, bigger telescope. With the computer, smaller telescope, right? So with the bigger telescope, you'll be able to see more things, but it will be harder to do it. And with the computer, you'll be able to see fewer things, but it'll be easier. Right? So it's your trade-off. If astrophotography is your eventual goal, you are going to want to get a motorized mount because you'll need it for astrophotography. All right, let's do a quick rundown of things to avoid. So here's my advice. If a telescope comes in a box and the box has pictures of things on it, like Saturn and Jupiter and the Orion Nebula, and it is implying that you will be able to see these things, don't buy that thing. Additionally, if a telescope looks like a toy, it's probably a toy. I don't even know what this thing on the right is. I think it's a telescope, kind of. It mimics another kind of telescope that actually is somewhat good, but I won't go into that. But it's a red, and anyway, it's kind of a weird little scope. But this thing on the left looks an awful lot like a telescope, but it's probably like a $40 or $50 telescope on Amazon or something like that. Everything on it is just super cheap, super skinny aluminum legs on the tripod. It's going to wiggle all over the place. It's super skinny, low quality, probably a plastic lens on the front. So if it seems like it's too inexpensive, you should probably run away. But like I said, especially if they're telling you that you're going to magnify 600 times and you're going to see all these amazing things, you want to run away from that. Okay. So here is my opinion after doing this for a while. The kind of my hard and fast, cold hard opinion. And opinions vary, but I think that $300 is a reasonable entry point for a decent telescope. This Dobsonian right here is a 4.5-inch Dobsonian. I know it's hard to tell how big it is, but if a child were using this, they would comfortably stand next to it and look through that eyepiece. So that eyepiece stands, roughly 3 feet off the ground. And this is a very common size telescope. It's light, it's easy to use, it's bomb-proof. They usually come in a little kit that will have 2 eyepieces, maybe a star chart, maybe a flashlight. You can see a lot of things with this telescope, and it will last a long time for you. So I think $300 is a pretty reasonable entry point. If you're spending less than that amount of money, you're running the risk of kind of wasting your money, in my opinion. So I've talked about accessories a little bit, and I mentioned star chart a couple of times. One of the hardest things about astronomy is knowing what to look at. So you have a nice telescope, what do you do? And I have a couple of bits of advice for that. So I have, this is my go-to star chart. I love this star chart. I've used it for probably 10 years now. Literally the same book. It is awesome. It has a weatherproof coating to it that I paid $10 extra for. Totally worth it because I cut my teeth on astronomy in Baton Rouge, which is like swimming basically most of the time. And this thing survived right through it. No big deal. So it's just really super easy to use, and you get comfortable with your telescope and your star chart. Whatever star chart you end up using, you kind of get an idea of like, hey, I tried to see that before and I couldn't, or I tried to see something like this before and I did. So this is just, I love the star chart. And but there's lots of things out there, but the Pocket Sky Atlas is pretty popular. I also have a set of these, which is another cheap set of star charts. There's I think there's 6 in the series, maybe 5. I usually buy them all together. They're not horribly expensive. They're all laminated. They're super nice. But this is just the book of overlooked objects. And there's a couple of them. They each have a theme. And it gives you a little description about each object. And it gives you the stars around the object that you would be looking for. So it's just nice. And you may see here that I've written page 2, page 72, page 77. That's not me not being able to count. What I've done is I've cross-referenced this book with my Pocket Sky Atlas. And you'll develop all kinds of things like that. But let's say you want to accessorize a little bit more. You can actually buy the scientific description and information about every object in the new general catalog, the NGC. This is the NGC. Right? It has all kinds of information in it. So if you have a star chart and you're like, hey, why can't I find this NGC object? You can pull out the NGC and actually read about it. And they might say, oh, it has a really low surface brightness, or it's really diffuse, or something like that. And like, oh, well, that's why I can't see it tonight. So that's helpful. I've had many nights where I've used things like that. So a red flashlight is pretty important because red does not affect your night vision. Just make sure it's not super bright, because even a bright red flashlight will still affect your night vision, especially if you're bouncing off like maybe a reflective table, or like your car is parked there and you have a headlamp on and you happen to turn your head and it bounces off your tail light or something. That will cause your pupils to constrict, and you want wide pupils when you're observing. And a notebook, because you write things down. You're like, hey, I saw this thing tonight. It was interesting. Or when I was looking for this other thing, this is how I found it. So, wrapping things up here, here's my review. Refractors, they cost more in general, but they deliver really awesome solar system views. If you want to see the polar caps on Mars, if you want to see the red spot on Jupiter, refractors are usually the way to go. Right? Now, don't get me wrong, my Dobsonian will see the red spot on Jupiter, but it's a decent sized Dobsonian. So Dobs cost less, and they are good for your deep sky objects. So these are your galaxies, your nebulas, things of that nature, things that are outside of our solar system, because they are light buckets. They're just really good at seeing faint things. So if you see a telescope that's on a tripod, that is going to be a refractor or possibly a compound reflector like the Schmidt Cass or the Maxitovs. Okay. And when you're just starting out, to make sure that you actually want a telescope, because you don't have the opportunity right now to go to an astronomical event and use somebody else's telescope, you want to start with your eyes, then some binoculars, and then if you still are interested, look into a telescope. Right? So that is what I have to say, and I am happy to discuss any details or share anecdotes or opinions, whatever you might have.
Hey, Trevor, I've got a question for you, if you don't mind. On the Dobsonian that you showed a little while ago, the 4.5-inch one.
Yeah.
Orion and maybe some others sell a tabletop version of that same telescope. They sell a 4.5-inch mirror version and a 6-inch mirror version. And the few times I've tried those, they seem to be pretty nice, except of course you have to put them on a table, and they're also at a lower price point. Have you ever had any experience with those? You having any thoughts about those?
Yep, I've used the 4.5-inch one before. I don't have a picture of it in this slide, but the price point is lower, and that is because the tube is a sonotube. It's a cardboard or a paper product of some kind, so it is definitely not built to last. But it is a solid little telescope, and it gives you some cool views. It doesn't look like much, but it does get the job done. I'm not sure to use a word that some people will know in here, but I'm not sure what the F ratio is on it because it is such a shorter tube than the traditional 4.5-inch. So it must be it must have a lower F ratio. So I don't know. I don't think that would affect very much of what you would be looking at with it. But anyway, yeah. So the main thing is that it's just a lower quality alt-az mount and the paper product tube. So if you are in a humid area and you don't store it correctly, you could see some deterioration of the tube. But yeah, it has like some kind of sealant on it that should keep you in in good use for a while. But I think, what is it called, like the Sky Scout or something? It has some name like that, doesn't it? The mini 4.5 inch.
Yeah, there is some name like that. They offer
Yep.
the basic one, and then they offer a model that has a computer assisted pointing system on it too.
Really, computer assisted pointing system. I don't even know what that would be. But
Well, it's, digital setting circles. It's non-motor.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So you point it north and make it level, and then okay.
Right.
Yeah. So that's that. Yeah.
Inbox. It tells you which way to move the scope, but it doesn't move it for you.
I see. So yeah. So there are some options. I think Celestron and Orion both have a model of that kind of telescope.
Do you have any favorite retailers for getting a starter kind of telescope?
My first telescope was an Orion, a Dobsonian, which is probably why I fell in love with them. So telescopes.com is a really good place. And the good news is, if you're ever lost in the woods, Orion will find you, so they can send you a new brochure. So if you buy a telescope from them, know that you will never be truly lost. They absolutely can find you. They're kind of like an alumni association. But no, I digress slightly. But seriously, Orion does have a really fantastic line of decent products. Nothing that's super top of the line, but you can get a nice set of filters. You can get a lot of accessories. You can buy your flashlights there. You can get some star charts, and you can get a whole line of Dobsonians. And I don't know, for the last maybe 10 years now, Orion has been stepping up with some higher quality stuff. I personally, would be a little bit standoffish about a company that was kind of famous for selling beginner stuff to now selling higher end stuff. That's just me, because I was around when they weren't selling the high end stuff. But I've got a friend who's got the motorized, the fully go-to Dobsonian from Orion, and he loves it. So and he's had it for years now.
And does it work mechanically okay?
Yeah, as far as I know. I mean, he's got a Lamalin cam he sets up on it, and he does like Facebook live streaming with it. So it seems to. I never hear him talk about like, oh, hold on a second, I got to realign or anything like that. It seems to stay on just fine for him.
Hey, Trevor, this is Donovan. It's been a great presentation. Really learned a lot out of this. My question is, in terms of eyepieces, what would you say would be at a basic level the most important eyepieces to have with you?
So if you buy one of these telescopes I've been talking about, these Dobsonians, they usually come with a 25 millimeter eyepiece and a 10 millimeter eyepiece. And because that's the standard set that you get with a telescope, that's kind of the tried and true pairing. I personally, when I do my observing, I actually have a 24 millimeter that I use and a 14. And I actually do most of my observing with those two eyepieces. And generally speaking, how do you know what to use? The bigger the number on your eyepiece, generally speaking, the wider the field of view you're going to get. So because I don't use computers on my telescopes, I will usually use the 24 millimeter to find something, because it'll give me a pretty wide field of view, and I'll point the telescope in the general direction of where I need it to be, and then I'll look in the eyepiece and move the telescope around until I see what it is that I'm looking for. And then if I want a more narrow field of view, then I'll switch to my 14. But I have the whole gamut of eyepieces. I've got as high as 40 or 44 millimeter, I think, and all the way down to like 3.6 millimeter. But every telescope has a focal length to it. It's usually printed right on the side of the telescope. And if you take your focal length and divide it by the focal length of your eyepiece, so your 14 millimeter, your 10 millimeter, whatever, that's going to give you your magnification. And generally speaking, once you start getting into the magnification of like 100, 120, 150, you're really pushing the boundaries of what Earth's atmosphere will allow you to see. The higher your magnification, the more you're going to magnify the turbulence in the atmosphere, which is why earlier when I said you can see these telescopes in boxes that will say 600x, 300x, sure, you can do that. Like if you put a 5 millimeter eyepiece into a telescope with whatever 300 millimeter focal length, you're going to get a massive magnification. Well, maybe not that one because that's only what 60. So put it into anyway. I can't do the arithmetic on the fly for whatever reason. But anyway, you can get 600x, 600x magnification relatively easily with a very small eyepiece, but it's garbage. There's no point in doing it because you're not going to see anything. So there's always this trade-off. When I'm talking about these crisp views of Mars through a refractor, it's not some super large image like you would see in a photograph. Even with the best telescopes, you're still looking at something that's pretty small, but it's crisp. And if you try to put a bigger eyepiece in to see it, or if you try to put a smaller eyepiece in to see it bigger, yes, it will get bigger in your field of view, but it's going to start to get fuzzy, where you can't focus it very well. So it's a trade-off. But to answer the question, directly, something in the low 20s, between 20 and 25, and then something in the low teens, you'll get a lot of mileage out of those two eyepieces.
Hey, Trevor, what was the NGC book that you were showing earlier?
This is the Sky Atlas 2000 second edition. I think I bought this used 10 years ago. So there might be some newer edition. But there's a giant sort of famous star chart called the Sky Atlas, and the pages on it I think are they're like 14 by 18 inch pages. So it's a very large format star chart, and it's really, really good. Don't get me wrong, it's really good. I have one, I love it. But boy, this one is so much easier, because you can hold it in your hand, operate the telescope with one hand, and that's why I like the pocket Sky Atlas. But for very deep sky observing, if I'm at a star party and I'm observing for 4, 5, 6, 7 hours, I'll have my Sky Atlas out. And it's but this is, like I said, it's got everything in it. So if you want to know about NGC 6224, it tells you it's a cluster with 100 stars in it. It's detached. It has a weak concentration of stars. Tells you how far away it is. Tells you the class of the stars. Tells you how old the cluster is. But that basic information, 100 stars, detached, weak concentration. That tells you that you're looking for maybe not a very pronounced star cluster. So that helps you find it. So that's why I like that book.
Trevor, talking about books and star guides, would you say really it's just a preference type if you're thinking about using either a book or using an app like Sky Portal or Sky Live or Star Walk or any of the myriad of apps available right now?
Yeah, absolutely. I do have one app on my phone. I don't even know what it is. That tells you how much I use it. But yes, a lot of people are going with the apps now. Really the only reasons I don't is because I just never got into it. I understand they are pretty good nowadays, and I think even some people have like mounted their apps to their telescopes and use them as like kind of makeshift computer guides. So you can, you mount the phone on the telescope, and then you can move the telescope around until you see what you want to see in the phone, and then you look through the eyepiece to see it. I just feel like if you have the phone out, you run the risk of, oh, let me just check Facebook real quick or whatever, and then your night vision is gone. So I'm just not a big fan of them, but definitely a preference thing. Because of the way my memory works, I like books because I have a very tactile memory. I know where things are on certain pages, and you just get used to it. But it is personal preference.
I have a question. First of all, that was a really great presentation. I actually learned quite a bit, so thank you. So let's say I've got a modest budget for a telescope, and one of the things I'm particularly interested in is photography. How much am I, like, in trying to figure out like a budget point? What are some other considerations that I need? Because I know that there's other accessories, like I was looking at these like little cameras that you can mount on the front of the scope that like narrows the, I think like the focal ratio or something. And
yeah.
There's like these DSLR cameras, and so I'm thinking, like, I'm looking at some of these scopes, and then I'm sure you probably know this, but like the price point when you go up in aperture, it's like almost exponential.
I don't actually know if it is exponential, but yeah, you're right. It goes up fast. So here's the good news. If photography is your goal, then aperture is actually not what you need. What you need is the mount. So if you are doing astrophotography, you don't actually need a lot of light collecting ability, because the camera, unlike our eyeballs, the camera has a memory. So for your eyeball, once a photon hits your eyeball, it's gone forever. It's one and done. But when a photon hits a camera's chip, I assume you're not using film, but when it hits the chip, it's counted and remembered. So a small telescope can point at an object for a long time and just keep collecting those photons, which is something that our eyeballs cannot do. But in order to do that properly and nicely, you have to be able to have the telescope point at the same object very stably for a while, several minutes at a time usually. So when you are getting into astrophotography, your main focus needs to be the mount as opposed to the telescope itself. So the very minimum you have to have is a, let me turn this scope here so you can see a little bit better. Can you see this, the mount from like, am I pointing at the camera correctly?
I can see it.
Okay, yeah, so you absolutely have to have this type of mount. It's called a polar alignment, and the reason you need that is because we know the Earth rotates, but if you set this up properly, this mount right here will actually be parallel to the axis of the Earth, and it will point exactly at the North Star. Curve exactly, or will turn exactly as the Earth turns, but because you have this polar alignment, if you don't have the polar alignment, what will happen is, even though the center of your picture will stay the same, the edges of your picture will actually start to rotate inside the picture, That's called field rotation. And that is the primary reason why Dobsonians cannot do astrophotography. Because you can motorize an alt-az mount so that it will point to the same object all night, but over the course of the night, that field of stars inside your eyepiece will rotate around whatever you have in the middle, because you're not pointed at you're not rotating properly with the Earth. So astrophotography, you should be far more concerned about the mount than the telescope. You can do some pretty killer astrophotography with a refractor that is only 2 or 3 inches in aperture. So that's the good news. You don't actually have to go crazy on the telescope, but the mount is important.
And then just to follow up with that, so what would I be looking at? Like, are there any guides or recommendations for things in terms of actually buying, like the imaging equipment and the you said like polar alignment, like maybe like an alt azimuth? Would you say that like maybe the like Schmidt Cassigrain would be good for photography, or are there like a particular type of refractor that would be good?
So if you're going to use a Schmidt Cass for astrophotography, you have to you still have to polar align. And most Schmidt Casses do not have a polar alignment ability out of the box. You have to buy something called a polar wedge for them, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's like a 23-degree wedge that you install underneath the telescope, so it tilts it the proper angle. And once you do that, then you can do some amazing things with the Schmidt Casses. And really, the sky is the limit, to use the unfortunate pun here. But I am not an astrophotographer, generally speaking. I know a little bit about it, but for me, the base level of astrophotography, like the base way to get into it, is polar mount like this with a refractor and a DSLR with a I think it's called a T adapter. Someone can chime in if I'm saying that, if I'm remembering correctly.
That's correct.
So you get a T adapter that you use in place of the lens on the camera body. You put this T adapter on, and it functions just like an eyepiece. So you put that T adapter on, and then it sticks into the eyepiece of the telescope, and you mess around a little bit with focusing, and you get a remote trigger for the camera, because you don't want to touch it once it's on the telescope, because it'll blur things. And from there, that's a pretty basic setup. Assuming you already have a DSLR, but even if you don't, you can buy a body, like a DSLR body with no lens on it, for pretty cheap. And especially if, like, the DSLR used market, I think is really good now because nobody buys them anymore. But that's a pretty basic setup. And I don't know, if I had to put a price point on that, I would say you could probably get that set up for under $1,000. Because a mount, like the tripod and the mount, are going to run you several $100s to get a decent starter one. Telescope would be a couple $100, and then a camera and a T adapter, another couple $100.
Yes, so I'm certainly no expert on this. I am also trying to get into this as well, Joe. I landed up after doing hours and hours of research, decided that I was going to go with a Celestron Nexstar. I went with a 4SE. It is a Schmidt Cassigrain. In full transparency, I've always been a Dobsonian fan since I've got into astronomy in the late 90s. But I've become very interested in astrophotography. So that's the route that I decided to go with. And as Trevor said, the T adapter. This particular scope has the wedge built in, and it is very simple to set up once you get familiar with it, but it's pretty exciting. I'm happy to chat more if you have any other questions.
Yeah, I was actually, it's interesting you mentioned that. I was thinking about getting maybe like an 8 SE or something. I was looking and doing a little bit of research, and I thought maybe that would be a good beginner telescope. Well, I don't know if it'd be a good beginner one, but I thought it would be a good one because of some of the reasons that you kind of outlined. And because it's not, I mean, I'd say it's still kind of on the lower end. I've seen some telescopes that go for like $10,000-$20,000, you know.
That's
But
pretty easy to do.
oh yeah, you know. So like this is, I think it's like $11.99 or something. And the way I look at it is it's compact enough that it's still big enough that I could see some good stuff, and it's compact enough that I could probably take it with me without having to do over much assembly. So I was thinking like initially that might be a good scope for me because it's going to take me a lot of time. I think the biggest challenge probably if you try to get into astrophotography, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's probably like half of it is the telescope, and I think the other half is like your skill with learning how to use the telescope and learning how to use the software, like stacking images and doing all that other stuff. And my take is that it's probably, I don't know, because like I've heard some people say it's better to buy a really expensive telescope because you get more bang for your buck. But I'm not of that philosophy. I think it's probably better to work with something smaller and learn how to use it and appreciate it more, and build up your familiarity with it. And then plus on the side, like you've got another cool telescope that you could share with somebody else if you want to bring someone along, I guess. But I'm thinking for me, that's probably going to be a good point for me to start with. And I guess I'm just trying to think about like how much am I looking at in terms of accessories and like the mount and all that other stuff. But yeah, I think that's like kind of where I'm going. I had something else, and I didn't know about the red flashlight. That's actually like really cool. I think I'm going to look more into that. I've never heard anybody mention anything about that, so I do appreciate you mentioning that.
Yeah, that's one of the first things. And I actually I went out to observe a couple weeks ago, and I couldn't find my flashlight that I normally use for who knows whatever reason. So I just grabbed my headlamp that has a red light setting on it. Like, okay, yeah, that's fine. And I got out to dark skies and I turned it on and I said, oh my God, I did not realize how bright this red light was. It was just, even though it was red, it was still just way too bright. So the whole night I had to like hold it in my hand and cover most of the light, and then just kind of spread my fingers and let a little bit of it cast out. Because you would be very, very surprised when you get under dark skies, like how dark can really be. But yeah, there's lots of astronomy specific red lights out there, or red flashlights out there that I would encourage you to look at astronomy specific one, because if you do just buy, if you just go to a camping store or whatever and get a headlamp that has a red setting, it's probably still going to be too bright, and there's usually not a dimmer. Sometimes you might have two settings on it, but generally speaking, astronomy specific ones will have a very dim setting or a some kind of potentiometer that you can dim it, and you'd be surprised you don't really need that much light.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much. I'm going to shut up and let other people ask some questions. Thanks.
Trevor, this is Mark. Can you hear me?
Yep.
I think everything. I've been reading a lot in the last 2 weeks. I think I'd read everything you said tonight, but I didn't understand it nearly as well as when you explained it. But what I basically, for the kids, I was thinking that I had already thought about the Orion SkyQuest XT 4.5. And then you go and then you see the 6 and the 8. Is that a big jump in terms of value to using a telescope and what you're going to see? Yeah,
I mean, I think that once you hit the 8-inch, you're in really good territory to really see to see enough things for a number of years that you won't get bored with it. So I would say, and maybe somebody with more experience with the smaller scopes could say, but I think with a 4.5 inch, you would probably have a little bit of trouble picking out a lot of the galaxies. You might be able to see bigger ones like Andromeda or Triangulum or something, or some of the Messier galaxies, which are typically brighter galaxies. But if you want to go, if you just want to look at deep sky objects and just start kind of picking off galaxies, in a 4.5, you're going to have some trouble with that. But definitely the 4.5 is going to pick up. It's going to pick up all your bright nebulas, or Orion Nebula. It's going to pick up all of your Messier objects probably. And if you don't know what the Messier objects are, it's kind of like the beginner's Bible for astronomy. It's 110 objects or 109 depending on if you're a purist. But it's 100 plus objects that are just really nice to look at. And bonus, there's a very short window in North America in late March, early April from the mid latitudes like we are, where you can go out at dusk and stay out till dawn and see all 110 objects. It's called the Messier Marathon. Loads of fun, not for the faint of heart, but there is a time when you could take a break for about 2 hours in the middle of the night, between midnight and 2 a.m. But I digress. Yeah, so the 4.5, you're going to have a little bit of trouble seeing some of the fainter stuff, or you're going to have a lot of trouble seeing the fainter stuff. But 6 inch, 8 inch, if you look at the basic geometry of it, as the radius goes up by 2 inches, you're not. If you go from 6 inch to 8 inch, that's a 25% increase, or a 30%, however you want to look at it, 33% increase in radius, but it's a much bigger increase in the area. Because you've got, it's pi r squared. So your radius is increasing linearly, but your area is increasing, of course, by squared. So you're almost, let's see, I'm not exactly doing the numbers in my head, but to go from 6 inch to 8 inch, you're almost doubling your amount of light collecting ability. So you are definitely getting more for your money when, and more than it might seem when you go from that 6 to the 8. And just to, in full disclosure, just because I have an extreme personality, my first telescope was the Orion 10 inch, which, I was driving like a Honda Civic or something at the time, and the tube would take up the entire back seat of my Honda. So just know what you're getting into. Like take those measurements and actually imagine a tube like that. It doesn't fit in a closet very well. It's kind of like mine just sat in my living room. Hey, there's my telescope, but I was new to it, so I used it all the time. So it was totally worth it. But anyway, so yeah, my first telescope was 10 inch, and now all these years later, I'm using a 12 inch Dobsonian now. So I really haven't gone for the crazy sizes yet. I think 12 or 14 is probably about where I would be comfortable for a very long time. And I tell you, I mean, I have never had a boring night with my 12 inch Dobsonian. I can see just anything that I would ever want to.
Thank you.
Trevor, we've got a question from Malika. She asks, what type of binoculars do you recommend for beginners?
So I pointed these ones out earlier. So these are Celestron 15 by 70s. So 70 millimeter aperture on the front, 15 on the back. So the 15 means like that's the, no, I hesitate to say that. I'm not going to say what kind of magnification it gets because I have to do the division and anyway. But I do recommend these. They are incredibly cost effective. Like I said, under $100, at least the last time I looked, which has admittedly been a little while. But they're sturdy, but they're not so heavy that you can't hold them, use them handheld. And even if you, excuse me, even if they do feel a little bit heavy, just get yourself a chair. And I have many times sat back in a chair, put my knees up, put the my elbows on my knees, and that's as stable as I need to be. So these things, I've gotten a lot of miles out of these, and I don't have it down here, but I was mentioning earlier about star charts and what to look for. So a little bit of a tangent here. The Astronomical League has these, if you are a member of any astronomical society that is also a member of the Astronomical League, which is basically all of them, so including RAS, if you go to the Astronomical League website, there are these things called observing clubs, and they're not like actual clubs that you get membership to. They are they're like observing challenges, where they'll give you a list of objects to look at, and it's the honor system, so look at these things, log what equipment you used, write some comments about it, and then you send it off to a volunteer coordinator, and they will send you a physical pin that says, I achieved this thing. And there are several clubs specifically for binoculars. I think I've done 2 or 3 of them, and I've done them all with these binos here. So one of them is the Messier catalog using binoculars. So I think you have to look at 50 or 75 of the 100 plus Messier objects using binoculars. And it's just a really awesome little program. And as long as you're a member of any astronomical society, wherever you are, it's totally free for you. You get this pin. It's a volunteer that runs it. And they have all the clubs are organized by, you can organize them by the equipment that you have or by your skill level. And there's really something for everybody, even all the way down to little kids. They have a Sky Puppy Club where you have to, do things that are oriented for kids. It's a great program, but it can really get you into astronomy by you don't just jump into the deep end. You have this nice guide that you can work with all the way up through super advanced guides. Like I still use them, and I think I rank among advanced observers at this point in my life. So I still have clubs that I've been working on for years because it's hundreds of observations, and I have records, logs that I keep of things, and it's fun to have the pins. I think I have like 12 or something, and I have them mounted on my telescope, so it's like a conversation piece. But anyway, so binoculars 15 by 70s are really a good starting point. They're cost effective. They're easy to hold. These things are massive. These are 20 by 80s, and they're at the brink of being able to hold steady.
Hey, Trevor, I wanted to offer one comment on the astrophotography question.
Mm-hmm.
This is a very complicated question. When you get an astrophotography, the complexity just magnifies. But there is one option that I have enjoyed a lot. I do astrophotography, and like Trevor said, really what you got to concentrate on is it's getting a good, solid, very precise mount for that kind of thing. But one cost-effective option is to get a rotating platform. And I know there are several companies that offer them. One company is called Eyepieces, and for about $400, you can get this rotating platform that sits basically on any kind of tripod, and you can mount a DSLR camera on it. And if you want to do wide field astrophotography, that is not through a telescope, just through a standard camera lens, you can put the camera on one of these rotating platforms, line it up with the North Star, line it up with north axis of the rotational axis of the Earth, and it will follow stars pretty well through the sky. Not with the precision that a more sophisticated mount will, but for wide field work, you can get some really nice results, nice Milky Way shots, nice constellation shots, that kind of thing. So if you're into that kind of astrophotography, that's not too expensive. If you already have a DSLR, these platforms start at about $300 or $400. So.
Yeah, I actually think I might be interested in that, because I know there are some things that maybe are not the regular stops for observers, but I'm a huge fan of like the Veil Nebula and the North American Nebula up in Cygnus, and those are enormous objects that you cannot fit in your telescope at one time.
Yeah.
But like a wide field with a H beta filter or something like that, you could probably do, or an O3 H beta for one and O3 for the other, I think, you could probably get some really cool shots of those huge nebulas.
Yep, absolutely can. Yeah.
Anything else? All right, well, if there's nothing else, I do encourage everybody to step outside tonight, and you can see in a line across the sky Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars. They're pretty bright. There's Jupiter and Saturn are pretty close together. They might be set by now, but no, I think I was looking at them about this time last night. But Mars is the showstopper right now. It's so bright, but you can see those things naked eye, no problem, and it's just kind of cool to see three. You know, when you start to get 3 or 4 planets in the sky at one time, it's kind of neat. But right now we have Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars in the night sky, and Venus in the morning sky. But it's very common. You know, it's not completely uncommon to see those 4 planets, you know, in the night sky all at the same time. And then sometimes Mercury will stick in there too, but it doesn't hang around very long.
Okay, well, if there are no more questions, I want to say first, thanks to Trevor. That was really good. I really enjoyed that. I learned something too. I thank you very much for doing that. It was a really good presentation. Really
Happy to
enjoyed
do it.
Yeah, it was good. And if you have any follow-up questions or something occurs to you after the presentation, you can feel free to contact us at the Richmond Astronomical Society. You can send an email. You can go to our website, richastro.org. Or you can send an email to president@richastro.org, and I'll either relay that to Trevor or you know, to the appropriate person. Either one of those works. So anyway, thank you all for attending. Really appreciate it. And like I said, if you want to come to any of our events or join us, or you just have a question, you know, feel free to contact us. Website's richastro.org.
All right, have a good night, everybody.
Yeah, everybody have a good night. Thanks again.